Well, good evening, everyone. I think we're now streaming live on YouTube. Welcome to this evening's meeting of the Ealing Business Partnership. This is the one meeting that the EBP has each year to ensure that the local authority fulfills its statutory obligations with respect to consulting on business rates. I'm Andrew Dakers. I'm Chief Executive of West London Business, but also a member of Ealing's LSP, representing the business community there. It's great to have some external sort of guests, I suppose, joining this meeting, as well as all of you involved directly in the council's operations. We have two key items on the agenda tonight, but we will first of all go through a few formalities and the first few items on the agenda before we get to the meat of the meeting. And my expectation is we'll probably spend about half an hour on each of the main items, with the opportunity for a bit of discussion and questions and answers at the end of each item. So, turning to the top of the agenda, do we have any apologies for absence, Katie?
Thank you, Chair. We've got one apology, and that was from Cameron Mirza, the Vice Chair.
Thank you. That's noted. I'm not aware of any urgent matters, unless you are, Katie. Item 2.
There are none, thank you.
And therefore, any declarations of interest that need to be made by members? I'm not seeing any hands go up or cameras switched on, so I'm going to assume not. That's actually useful reminder for me to flag that if at any point during the meeting you do want to come in, please make use of the reactions button and the sort of raise hands sort of tool there, and equally make use of the chat to bring my attention to any questions that you want to raise. Matters to be considered in private, I'm not aware of any. That's item 4. So we'll move on, I think, to item 5, the minutes of this meeting last year. And I wonder whether those few that were with us, maybe Councillor Donnelly, whether you can recommend approval, assuming you've had a chance to look over the minutes, or indeed raise any queries or points of accuracy at this point.
I think, Andrew, possibly you meant myself as...
Of course, yes. Councillor Murphy, you were with us, weren't you? Are you happy with the minutes?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to approve those minutes, Andrew.
Fantastic. And I haven't seen any objections from elsewhere, so we'll take them as read. I assure everyone attending, I did proof them not long after the meeting took place to check it was an accurate record myself. So without further ado, on to item 6, the first sort of substantial item of the evening, and I think it's going to be a bit of a double act tonight of Shabana and Councillor Donnelly talking us through this item. So over to both of you.
So I think it's a 3-way.
Oh, is it?
With Ross.
Okay.
Ross
okay, fantastic. Well, lots of input. So Ross too, welcome.
So we're all tooled up. So yeah, so for the majority of the time, you'll hear from a more technical description of what's being proposed from officers, which I think is what you've been used to in the past. And particularly, I know this item 2 is of particular interest to the business community, but the context of item 2 is obviously item 1. So there's quite a few slides, but we're going to try to run you through them as quickly as we can, so you get a sense of where we are at the moment. And this is the overall picture that we're trying to get across to you. Our key messages, the budget for the coming year, the core funding, the government funding settlement, our medium-term financial strategy. I find this a very difficult thing to talk about because the way in which we're currently funded is so short term, is so hand to mouth, that to be required as we are to produce a medium term financial strategy often feels just absurdly irrelevant. But we do doggedly produce a medium term financial strategy, and we report upon it quarterly at Cabinet. But it's very difficult, and the medium term in the current situation is getting to feel like it's the month after next. So talk briefly about our proposals around 22-23 council tax, local government funding reforms, and the risks we face. Next, please. So just in terms, and I'll hand over after this one, just in terms of political context, these are some of, in no particular order, the things that have been pressing upon us and pushing us to the position that you will see. The paper to Cabinet went out yesterday evening, which will fill in, obviously, the gaps in the paperwork that we were in a position to put forward ahead of this meeting. We were hit very hard by COVID-19, relatively hard in a national context, relatively hard in a London context, and we worked very hard, not least with the assistance of local business and the community, to produce I think an outstanding result in accessing and supporting our vulnerable people. But protecting and prioritising the vulnerable remains the priority, and also the most difficult thing for us to achieve and to fund. You'll see in the bottom left there, about 60 pence in every pound that we spend goes into supporting adults and children's services. 6 out of every 10 pounds goes into that through social care. And I think that's a much bigger figure than people understand that it is. We know from the relatively limited amount of social group, focus group work that we do, that there's quite often a big divergence between what we understand in what we do and what the public understand in what we do, what the public understand about the value of council tax, about what we spend money on, and all the rest. You'll hear later on that Cabinet next week will hear a recommendation from me and officers to take 1.99% rise to council tax, plus for another year 1% social care precept on top. These two things are embedded in what the government now describes as core spending power. So the government effectively describes us in local government as having a particular funding for the coming year. But when you unpick that, that funding assumes that we take the maximum 1.99% rise to council tax that's allowable without a referendum, and that we take the 1% rise for the social care precept. So these things are increasingly now baked in, and decisions for us in all directions are made more difficult because of this recent surge in the cost of living. We've been used to operating at almost zero inflation now for over a decade. Suddenly we have inflation at a 30-year high and still rising. And the upshot of that, of course, means that even by taking the increases in council tax, etc., that are available to us, our own spending power is in danger of lagging behind the costs that we will face in the year and the years ahead. So prioritising and protecting the vulnerable and protecting ourselves from the future. We faced, probably in the last 3-4 years, we've had 2 once-in-a-lifetime economic shocks through Brexit and COVID. I mean, that's quite an extraordinary situation, but it has, I think, focused our minds very carefully on how we need to be on the ball to address further shocks. And so we've looked again this year at our own resilience, our approach to reserves, our ability to respond flexibly to demands expected and unexpected that might be put upon us. So that's the political context. Those are the key messages that we're driving through. So I'll pause there, I think. Next slide, please, Shabana. So I think, Ross, are you picking up?
I am. Thank you, Councillor Donnelly. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Super. So I'm going to pick up in a bit more detail how the council's budget looks from a probably quite a technical perspective, but nonetheless, hopefully informative. The first slide I've got here in front of us is just to provide the broad context of the overall expenditure and significance of the overarching activities that the council undertakes. We quite often and quite rightly, as is our statutory responsibility to do so, talk about setting a balanced budget from a net budget requirements perspective, which you'll see at the top of this slide equates to around £256 million. As hopefully many of you will be aware, the breadth and scope of the council activities is actually much more significant than that. We are a very complex and diverse organisation, as you'll see this slide sets out, both from a tabular format on the left, where it shows the different service areas and responsibilities that we undertake, and also graphically on the right using the circles. The extent to which is that we spend around £1.1 billion per annum all in, when we look at the totality of the money that's passported through to schools, the money that's spent within the housing revenue account specifically for housing tenants and recipients of then services, and when we take into account the totality of corporate items and the variety of day-to-day service obligations that we undertake, some of those which Councillor Donnelly has already touched upon most extensively from a cost perspective, being social services. So this hopefully helpful graphical representation, that purple circle in the middle, just goes to highlight the value and volume of activity that we as an authority with a variety of statutory duties undertake, and that results in expenditure, as I say, of around £1.1 billion per annum. So just a bit of overall context that frames the net budget requirement, which is actually less than a quarter of our gross revenue expenditure. The next slide then talks about the council's core funding position. As you'll be aware, we receive funding from a variety of different means and sources, but this really goes to highlight the dependency the council has on the funding sources of the elements of business rates that we retain. You're all aware that we don't have any impact or input on the setting of those business rates. That's a central government function, and the valuation comes from a subset of central government, as you'll be aware, called the Valuation Office. We don't control or influence that, but we do collect those rates and passport some of that back through to central government. And obviously, as part of central government's funding allocations, we are allowed to retain a certain amount of that. The proportion of that is broadly 60-40 in very simplistic terms. You will see, therefore, that a large chunk of our £256 million comes from our residents. We are reliant on those contributions to council tax to the tune of circa £160 million in cash terms. So really significant fees and income come from our residents. So that continues to be the case. We'll talk a little bit later on about some of the proposed changes that are not yet in place and how that might change some of those distributions and proportions that we've got on the council's core funding screen in front of us. But for now, it's predominantly business rates and council tax that provide that net revenue budget source that allows us to set statutorily our budget through full council at the beginning of March. Next slide, please. So the local government finance settlement is announced mid-December. and this is the contribution from central government's perspective, inclusive of the spending powers, and that includes things such as our ability to increase council tax within their overall limits that central government set to us. That actually gets announced, quite surprisingly, very close to the date for which we're required to set the balanced budget. We typically, as it says there, find out in mid-December, specifically the 16th of December in last calendar year and this financial year. And we have a very short amount of time with which to work, with then to weave that into the overall medium-term financial strategy, which combined with the council saving agenda, then allows us to deliver a balanced budget for the following financial year. So we are statutorily required to set a balanced budget in advance of that financial year becoming live on the 1st of April 2022. The local government finance settlement, which technically is provisional, it's not final. We won't find out the final settlement until March, which is typical. So the provisional figures suggest to us that there is circa £13 million of grant that we can use within the council to fund council obligations, which is very helpful, obviously. What is more challenging, and this relates to the point that Councillor Donnelly made about the ability to determine a genuine, legitimate and proactive medium-term financial strategy, is that circa 70% of that funding came with a one-off tag, and that means that there is no guarantee for that funding in the following financial year, and therefore from a budget in perspective we have to reverse that 13 million out when we come to look at the 23-24 budget. So we work on a very, very, very short-term basis at the moment, which reflects the kind of short-term nature of the announcements that central government are currently prepared to make from a funding settlement from a local government perspective. And that means that it does make it incredibly difficult for us to forecast with accuracy the medium-term financial plan and be proactive as we would like to be in that space. We come on to touch a little bit later on about some of the further deferrals, which was an attempt to bring some certainty into that funding cycle, both the baseline funding reset and the fair funding review. So we'll not expand on that too much further at this stage. We'll come on to look at that, as I say, a little bit later on. So the medium-term financial strategy, the MTFS, is effectively a 4-year rolling basis. It's a financial plan. It's an articulation of service delivery in financial terms. We are required, as I've said, to statutorily, on a single year in advance basis, set a balanced budget. But the context in which we are now required to do that is increasingly complex. If there's one word that I would use to describe it, it's uncertainty. There are a myriad of pressures ranging from genuine demand-led service obligations, new demand coming into that services, whether it be looked after children or young people with more complex needs or adults that require a greater level of support. There is a constant surge of demand that hits our services, quite rightly, that requests services for the council to provide. On top of that backdrop, we are dealing and trying to understand more clearly the long-term impact of COVID-19. For those of you that may choose to read the in-year financial reports that the councils publish on its website, we are currently experiencing somewhere in the region of £12 million of COVID pressure from a 21-22 perspective. We know that won't disappear overnight. We know that the need is still there to service many of those needs and obligations that sit around that. But it's very difficult to determine exactly how much of that manifests itself, but it's another area of uncertainty for us to deal with. And then lastly, there's that challenge I've just touched on, which is the short-termism of announcements from a funding mechanisms perspective. So we do have to wait until very late in the calendar year, i.e. mid-December, and therefore period 9 of the financial year, which again is quite late, for us to then fully understand what our resourcing is from a central government perspective, which is a key component in our overall considerations. The MTFS is also there to help us, as far as possible, plan prudently, sensibly. Prudence includes looking at the council's financial resilience, making sure it holds sufficient reserves and balances to deal with the unforeseen. I am statutorily required to make a financial assessment as to the appropriateness of the level of reserves and resources that we hold to address uncertainty. In that context that I've just described, that's actually increasingly difficult to do. So when we deliberate the appropriateness of the medium-term financial strategy, it's not purely about setting a balanced budget and looking at what number of savings we need to make the budget balance. It's actually much broader than that. It's about looking at the overall capacity that the budget provides from a service delivery perspective, but also, and importantly, looking at the level of financial resilience and reserves the council holds. So what does that mean when we look forward beyond 22-23, for which we are proposing a balanced budget as part of the Cabinet report next week? Well, given that uncertainty, we've had to make a number of estimates and work on assumptions as to the types of grants and the types of incomes that may be reversed back out in future years' local government financial settlements. And we've broadly captured that, albeit at a high level, within the 23-24 to 25-26 table. And that suggests that there's somewhere around 22.7 to around £24.5 million of budget gap forecast going forward. Now, we have, if we're being transparent, typically received settlements from central government, i.e. that the £13 million that we've talked about in the 22-23 financial year that will hopefully help to close that gap. But we don't know what that looks like yet, because we've not had any confirmation. Can I just check? People can still hear me. I just heard a funny noise pop up on my machine.
Absolutely, we can. All
Super.
good.
Yeah, I'll continue. Thank you, Andrew. So yeah, we're currently pitching the budget gap in the region of £22 million per annum, and that's an individual incremental number. So that's £22 million in 23-24, an additional £24 million in 24-25, and an additional £24.5 million in 25-26. Needed to say that those figures will change as we understand more funding announcements as and when they come through. So the recommendation from a 22-23 only perspective is to increase council tax by 1.99% and to increase the adult social care precept by 1%. Very broadly speaking, 1% increase on our council's council tax base equates to about £1.5 million in real terms. That's actually a figure that's sometimes much lower than people expect. Given the challenges we face, we need to look at the availability of all resources to deliver on the service commitments to protect the vulnerable. And you'll clearly see within the adult social care precept that money is ring-fenced for the provision of adult social care. What we do look at very carefully alongside the appropriateness and the recommendations for increasing council tax is what's called our council tax reduction scheme. So this is a scheme that all local authorities are required to have, but for which local authorities have the autonomy to determine the appropriateness and the levels at which that's set. Ealing Council, quite rightly, has a very progressive council tax reduction scheme and has had for a number of years now. It does cost the council a significant amount of money. In total, it costs in the region of £28.2 million. So that's a cost that the council sits with. It does provide relief dependent upon the assessment of the individual in receipt of that benefit of up to 100% relief on council tax bills. There are two bandings that we work with, and the two different types of protected and non-protected status have different bandings dependent upon the the weekly income of the individual or the family unit. In kind of real terms, you'll see there it actually protects at the different levels that sit within the scheme overall in excess of 25,000 individuals or households within the borough. So it does provide an awful lot of protection to those individuals and families that are facing significant and continued financial challenges. Just whilst we're on council tax, two other pieces of hopefully relevant information. We are continuing to offer council tax relief for care leavers. So that's young people aged up to 25 will be in receipt of a 100% discount on their council tax. And the council's policy is to continue to charge an empty property premium of 300% where properties have been empty for a period of over 10 years. That sounds a fairly startling number. In practice, it's actually very few properties, as you might imagine, that are actually left empty for that period of time, and it's done from the purpose of bringing those assets and those houses back into use to meet the housing need of the borough, which, as people on the call will be aware, is significant to say the least. So this is an articulation of the budget overview. We are proposing, as you would expect us to be, a balanced budget for 22-23. To achieve that balanced budget, as I touched on very briefly before, we have to deliver a number of savings. So we make savings from within the service budgets using different techniques, working sometimes with partners to generate a level of savings that can then help curtail the availability of budget that we have. So we are proposing, as part of this budget, from a 22-23 perspective, savings of 10.3 million, specifically within the general fund, and that 10.3 million goes to contribute to the achievement and the setting of the 256 million pound that we talked about. Within the overall cycle of savings and growth, we are making provision within those numbers for investment back into the services for some of those much needed demand and pressure areas that I referenced earlier on. That totals 18.7 million on a gross basis for 22-23, providing much vital resources into those areas experiencing the highest demand. And of course, we also make provision available for new capital investment, of which around 6.25 million of that sits within the 22-23 financial year. So kind of final three slides from myself before I pass back to Councillor Donnelly for any closing remarks that are appropriate, and then we'll hand over to Nick. This is just the three areas that currently remain unknown from a funding reforms perspective: fair funding review, baseline reset, and the business rates revaluation. These have been talked about for some time, particularly the first two. As you'll see there, they are somewhat overdue already. They are absolutely fundamental to us understanding and having any medium-term certainty from a financing point of view. We are not clear as to where those reforms currently sit. What we do know is that the absence of any detail or direction of travel with regard to both fair funding and business rates baseline reset makes it incredibly difficult. Our job's even harder from a financial forecasting perspective. Nick can talk in more detail if individuals are interested in that about the business rates revaluation, other than to say it has been shortened to a much reduced revaluation cycle period, which to a degree is helpful, but also that causes quite a lot of change on a shorter term basis than we've experienced before. And again, as it says there, that final point, the impact from a council budgeting perspective on the 2023 implementation is currently unknown from our side. So last two slides from me. It's right for me to reference risks as I'm professionally required to do so. Clearly, we've put forward over £11.2 million of savings, or £13.3 million of savings over the MTFS period. They do require resource. to deliver, and they are not without challenge. We, as you may have seen, if you've read one of the financial monitors that we do in year that we report through to Cabinet that are published publicly on CMIS, we do look at the savings delivery very closely. We risk assess them, and we determine and we put in place actions to bring those back on track as and when there's needed. So it's right to flag that there are savings delivery risks. Longer term, we clearly need to continue to work on that endeavour to identify further savings to make sure that year on year we can deliver a balanced budget going forward. Part of the issue and the challenge we've touched on already is really understanding and knowing what that demand-led pressure looks like, particularly in the three areas of children, adults and temporary accommodation. We continue to be effective working in the preventative space through the Future Ealing programme in influencing those, but they will no doubt continue to present financial pressure to us going forward. It's probably right to say that in the current inflationary environment, with the complexities of obligations on businesses increasing, not least from a national insurance employer's contribution, and many of the challenges that businesses have struggled to deal with through the prolonged pandemic that we faced, there will be a higher incidence of contractor failure. We look and we try and work with contractors to prevent that happening. We have got quite a progressive social value framework, which we hope will bring benefit back into the borough, but it's a risk that we're very much alive to. I won't go back over the cost pressures more generally about COVID, but we have seen significant impact of our income. We did receive some funding support from central government for a short period to help cover that. That funding support's now cesated. So all of those income losses that we now receive due to the pandemic are costs that we have to fund and deal with from an authority's perspective in its own right. And then the final point is that one that I've laboured a number of times this evening, which is about uncertainty, both in the immediacy and from a future perspective in terms of some of those bigger challenges. So, in summary, we are proposing a balanced budget for 22-23, inclusive of a 1% increase on social care precept and just short of a 2%, be it 1.99% increase on Ealing's council tax, so circa 3%. We are very much focused on delivering key services to protect the vulnerable within the borough. We recognise that we work in very tight resource constraints, and our programmes that really focus on those areas that we've touched on, predominantly social care, both from a children's and adults perspective and a temporary accommodation perspective, are things that we take very seriously and we deliver to the best of our ability within the resource constraints that we've got. And that becomes increasingly difficult the longer we look forward and we see the backdrop of the uncertainty and the overall financial challenges that we have as an authority. And I'm going to park there and just pass back very briefly to Councillor Donnelly in case he wanted to make any comments on those slides that I've just touched on.
Yeah, thank you, Ross. Yeah, I won't labour the points other than to say from a political, but also from an administrative standpoint, we produced a budget within 6 weeks of the government telling us how much money we have. The grant settlement was slightly better than we had anticipated it to be, but we had no real notice of that. So we have to respond. I should also point out that the budget put forward does include cuts. This isn't a matter of, this year round everything is everything's come up roses. What we've done, we've embedded new cuts for the umpteenth year in a row. We haven't had to make as many cuts as we thought we would have to because of the nature of the grant funding that came our way. But if I say to you in business terms, the result of us getting this funding is that our book deficit for next year doubled overnight because it's funding we cannot assume that we will get again. You get a sense of how every time we think we're going forward, we're actually sliding backwards. So in the context of what we have available. I think we sought to create a balance between investment, resilience, and protecting the borough against whatever may be to come. But I think you've heard enough from Ross and myself, so thank you. Well, answer any questions if you like.
Well, thank you both, Councillor Donnelly and Ross. Lots for us to chew over there, and I think, as ever, a fairly unenviable position that you find yourselves in, trying to both turn around a budget in such a short period of time, but also grappling with a medium-term financial strategy that can move sort of before your very eyes and has so many unknowns underpinning it. I think we'll come back to you with questions. I'm hoping that everyone is making notes of questions they'd like to ask shortly, and hand straight over to Nick Rowe for your presentation on the business rates. Nick.
Right, thanks, Andrew. Yeah, so I'm Nick Rowe, Assistant Director for the local taxation, which covers amongst the services council tax and more specifically tonight business rates. So for those of you who may have been on in previous years, apologies, you may have heard some of these, but it's always quite a useful overview. You know, I think we've already heard both from Ross and Councillor Donnelly the importance of business in Ealing, and I think that's probably been highlighted to us more than any time over the past 2 years with the COVID pandemic. So we still have about 11,000 businesses in Ealing who are paying business rates, and a further 6,000 who aren't business rates payers but are conducting businesses usually from either shared accommodation or home accommodation. Now that makes us a large borough in terms of business rates. We're the 20th biggest in the whole of the country, 12th biggest in London in terms of rates collected, and 8th in terms of the number of NNDR properties. So certainly the number of issues we've faced over the past 2 years, as you can well imagine, has been sizable. And the impacts that we've seen from COVID have significantly impacted both businesses and our own services. And, you know, I think as we're going through tonight, you'll see that those impacts are still ongoing, both for us and the businesses we manage. So next slide, please, Shabana. So in terms of the grants, I think we've given an update on this in the past 2 years now. I must admit, if you'd have asked me 3 or 4 months ago, I think we all hoped that the grant situation had finished and we would be able to move back to some degree of normality. We'd issued almost £134 million in cash grants, which had been issued to qualifying businesses, so 22,000 awards, and a further 101 million in reliefs. And when I'm talking tonight, I'll talk about grants a lot, and by grants it means an actual physical cash payment. A relief is a reduction in the rates bills. So yeah, a further £101 million in relief as well. So since we first began, we'd had 18 different government grant schemes, 24 different periods of awards, each with their own qualifying rules, guidance. It was confusing for me and my officers, so I can only imagine how confusing it has been in sometimes for the business community about which grants were payable when. I think at one period, Christmas, the previous Christmas, we had something like 8 grant schemes in 35 days. So it has been incredibly complex. We've had 2 relief schemes, and as I say, I think we thought that was going to be it. Then just before Christmas, we found out that there was then going to be a further 2 new grant schemes and 2 new relief schemes. So obviously today I want to cover off what they are and what we're doing on those. So next slide, please, Bana. So the 2 new grant schemes were the Omicron Hospitality and Leisure Grant, and that's specifically for businesses who were impacted during the Omicron outbreak. And there's a very detailed list of the things it includes, and it includes things like pubs, restaurants, leisure venues, accommodation, which includes hotels and B&Bs, etc. So that is a specific grant. And then the Omicron Additional Restrictions Grant, which was to effectively provide support to some of the businesses who fell just outside of the qualifying criteria. As always, when central government introduce these schemes, it's very much black and white in their scheme rules, and very much a cliff edge in terms of the grant application process. It's simply a yes or no, and with no flexibility. So this additional restrictions grant has given us that degree of flexibility around the government's stipulated rules. We have got application processes. We've gone live with them. The government had told us, despite not giving us details of the grants until we came back until January, that all grants must be applications only. We couldn't pay on existing data, which we'd always tried to do previously, where people have made applications in the past. And I know for the businesses or the support networks on the call now, it's quite a lengthy process given the amount of information that the government state we have to have. But again, we have to go through that whole application process again. So we've got to get all the applications in, assessed and passed for payment by the 28th of February. So my team have worked tirelessly since we returned. The applications went live last week. And can be found via the council's website, the business newsletters, and we've also been proactively contacting all the businesses who we believe could qualify. So anyone's entitled to apply, but obviously we are proactively trying to ensure that those ones we have identified as having a likelihood of qualifying will receive additional direct mailing communication as well. So grant levels will be based on the rateable values, and as always on these grant schemes, the government have split it down based on the rateable value in 3 bands: up to 15,000, 15 to 51,000, and 51,000 and above for rateable value. And the grant payments would be £2,667, £4,000 and £6,000 respectively. So that is for the Omicron hospitality and leisure based on rateable value. So we've been given 1.6 million for the Omicron hospitality and leisure. Just to give you an idea, on the restart grants, which was the last grant we paid out, which also went to these leisure hospitality businesses, etc., we paid out 16 million. So the 1.6 million is far lower than we were paying out before. But these hospitality venues on the last rounds were getting grants of up to £16,000, so, or 18,000, sorry. So this time it's a far smaller sum, and I think the government are saying that reflects the impacts that they've found. And we've received a further 772,000 for the discretionary scheme. Again, for the previous discretionary schemes to date, we have been able to allocate 12 million. So again, it's a fairly small sum in comparison to what we've been able to pay out previously. And next slide, please, Shimana. So the qualifying criteria you can see on the screen. The Omicron hospitality and leisure very clearly is for designated hospitality, leisure and accommodation businesses. Now on the website, there is a comprehensive list of the businesses in the hospitality and leisure sector who do qualify for this, and those that don't but can apply for the additional restrictions grant. So again, if you're dealing with the business, please, I suggest they look at the listing that's there. They are the businesses we can pay these grants to. If there are any questions or doubts, the team will respond to any emails, and we're going to try and get as much of this grant paid out as quickly as we possibly can. So to qualify for the grants, businesses will either qualify for one or the other. They must have ongoing fixed business or trading related costs. So that means, they are a property owner or renting a business, as opposed to someone who is trading from a residential address. They must have been trading on the 30th of December 2021 and able to demonstrate they've suffered a significant fall in income due to COVID. So again, these are the criteria which people who have applied previously will recognise from previous grant schemes. they must be registered and have a principal trading address in Ealing with a current business rates account. Now, again, I think that's people are aware of these from previous rules, and the final measure is around the business subsidy allowance. So that previously was called state aid. Now, the state aid rules have been relaxed to a certain extent since they've become subsidy control. I would recommend any businesses who feel they may be impacted on this to do check the rules. But just to say, the highest category is businesses, they wouldn't qualify if they've received more than £11 million in relief. Now, we're not aware of any of our businesses who have received that level. Obviously, some of the national companies may well be in that situation, but again, for the criteria and the award categories, we don't think that's going to be the case, but we will be verifying that prior to any payments. Next slide, please, Shabana. So that was the grants. I will come on to the relief in a minute, but just to give you an idea of the business rates charges for next year, and apologies, I've just spotted a typo, that should be the 2022-23 figures. So these are the figures for the business rate bills, which will be coming out in March and April to you all. The good news is the government have put a cap on the multiplier. Now, again, they did that last year, which means whereas normally there is an inflationary increase in the business rates bills, they have capped that. So there will be no increase in the multiplier this year. So the multiplier is 51.2p in the pound, and the small business multiplier for businesses up below 51,000 is 49.9p. So that is some good news that there is that inflationary protection on that. And the Crossrail supplement remains there at 2p in the pound. Okay, now the next one is the retail relief. Now we'll come back onto that in a minute, so we can skip past that for the time being, Shabana, and we'll go on to the next slide, please. So the other announcement which came out, which I think we actually got the information for that one on the 23rd of December, was the COVID Additional Restrictions Fund, which is a bit of a mouthful, so we're calling CARF. Now, a number of businesses had put in appeals against their rateable values due to the COVID impacts, particularly offices where people weren't occupying them. The government had stated that they would change the legislation and no appeals against rateable value could be accepted for COVID reasons. And instead, they would recompense companies through this new relief. So it is a relief, not a grant, which means it will be applied as a reduction to rates bills. It will only apply as a one-off credit for this current year's rate bills. So for 21-22, the government scheme rules have stated that it can't be granted to anyone who has already received the extended retail discount, which is the fairly sizable discount which is currently applied to retail outlets rate bills. It can only be for an occupied building, an occupied business, as opposed to an empty premises. The business must have been impacted by the pandemic. Now, again, I think we probably struggle to find many businesses that haven't been impacted by the pandemic. And the disappointing thing for Ross in terms of the finance is we've been told we cannot pay it to any London Borough of Ealing properties. So although we are paying out 10.5 million, none of it will be going to our own properties, which means that the additional sums will be going to the other qualifying businesses. Okay, next slide, please. So we've taken a paper along for all of the grants and reliefs. All of these need to be gain member approval, and a scheme has been approved. For this one, we will be able to identify an auto award to qualifying businesses. We believe that once we have taken out the businesses who are receiving the retail relief and some other businesses who've been excluded, such as advertising boards and parking spaces, we will be able to give a fixed percentage, which is approximately 15% of the current year final rate bills after other reliefs and everything have been deducted to all businesses. So that will be applied. We're still waiting for the software solution to be able to deliver that. And the other thing that we've been allowed to do, whereas for the grants we were given a closing date to the 28th of February, for the reliefs, we have been told legally we can award up to the 30th of September 2022. Now, obviously, we are very keen to get those sums onto accounts in this current financial year, so next year we can start from scratch. But obviously we'll give more information on that as soon as we possibly can, but because we can auto award rather than go for applications, we're hoping that will be a quicker process. For businesses who receive it, if that puts the account into credit, we can either then do a refund for that credit balance, as we always will if an account is in credit, or that money can be carried forward to reduce the 2022-23 bill. So no one's going to miss out on payments whenever we award them. Next slide, please, Shabana. Okay. So general information in terms of business rates for next year. As always, any business who have requested 12 monthly instalments, they will continue for the next calendar year. If you haven't already got 12 months and would like to pay by 12 months instead of the original 10 months, which all our schemes are under, please let us know and we can move your account. Any new accounts which we set up now, we're automatically moving them to 12 months. So I'm sure many of you will have already received that. The 22-23 bills will be processed on the 12th of March, and you should be receiving them on or before the 21st of March. So just to give you an idea, in the table that you can see, that just shows the net collectible debit, which is how much money we are collecting from business. Now, as you can see, there's been some fairly sizable fluctuations over the past few years, and that is down to the various retail relief schemes which have been in place. So as you can see, we had a drop of 53 million in collectible value from 2019 to 2020, and that was predominantly down to the retail payments which we made to businesses, which came to 58 million in the first year. So and again, there's been a slight adjustment because the scheme rules on retail relief changed in 21-22. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, very quickly, this just shows the rates retention. I think Councillor Dollenly and Ross have already touched on, whereas with council tax, everything for what we collect in council tax, we retain approximately 80% of it. For business rates, what we collect now, we only retain 30% of it, with the government taking 33% and the Greater London Authority taking 37%. Okay, so just 30% of business rates payments remains with Ealing. And whereas in previous years we've talked about a London pool, which effectively shared some of the financial gains, but also shared some of the risks around business rates, that pooling arrangement ended in 2021. So currently we are back to the standalone financing of business rates, but with discussions are going on for future potential in that area as well. Next slide, please, Shabana. Again, I think we've mentioned this in previously as the London Living Wage Discount Scheme. In April 2016, we introduced a new scheme where if businesses were accredited with the Living Wage Foundation, we would provide a discount for twice the cost of the London Living Wage accreditation. That has been extended again for a further year, and I know a number of businesses have taken that up. But again, if your business is or about to become accredited, then we will contribute the cost of that accreditation. So that's the subscription for the Living Wage Foundation accreditation. Okay, next slide, please. So the final one is just to talk about the schemes for this year and to give you a quick update on those. So multipliers, as we said, there is no increase for next year, so they remain as they were. The retail relief scheme I've talked about a fair bit, and that has changed considerably over the years. So in 2019-20 for retail relief properties, a new relief was introduced which gave a 33.3% reduction. That was increased to 50% in 2021 when with the COVID implications for the start of 21-22, 100% relief was given for the first 3 months of the financial year. And as COVID restrictions eased, that relief was reduced to 66% from July onwards. We were expecting that relief to be totally removed this year, but the government have now announced that there will still be a 50% relief, which will be payable for 2022-23. So that's any retail properties, which does include a number of other things, not just retail, but also includes leisure, hospitality, which includes, pubs, estate agents, etc., etc.
Nick,
So,
can I give you a 2-minute warning as we're coming up to 8 and I'm keen for us to take a few questions?
I'm literally on the last slide now. Okay. So just to state as well, there's no nursery relief this year. So there's been 2 years where nurseries have received 100% relief. That has been removed by central government for this year. The transitional scheme is following a and now it's been so long since we've last had the revaluation. All the businesses are now out of transition. So, but there will still be some small payments to businesses on that. And finally, as Ross touched on, I just see Ross has sent his apologies. I know he had another meeting to go to at 8. The revaluation was originally due to take place in April 2021, which initially had been postponed from April 2019. We've now been told definitely that the reval will take place from April 2023. They are doing the valuations at the moment. The AVD is the antecedent valuation date, which is the date, the effective date that they value all properties at. And that was as at the 1st of April 2021, which obviously isn't ideal to have your valuation date in the middle of a pandemic. Now, the idea with the revaluation, it should be net revenue neutral. So across the country, it shouldn't raise any additional revenue. But obviously what that does mean is there's still some huge changes for affected businesses on a local level. So as soon as we get any information on that at all, we will share that with businesses immediately. We normally get the draft list probably around November time. So that'll be November 2022 with the new valuations coming in from April 2023. But obviously, as soon as we get anything on that or any timelines, we will communicate those with the business community. And that was all I was going to say. So it's a very quick run through there, Andrew, but hopefully somebody's...
Fantastic. Thank you, Nick. Very, very thorough as always, and congratulations again to your team in managing to keep all of those grant schemes moving over the past, well, it's now 2 years. But I think it's been, as you noted, challenging for your team and also challenging for the local business community to keep up with the complexities. I'm going to suggest we perhaps just take questions for you, Nick, first of all, and then we'll turn to Shabana and Councillor Donnelly for any questions on the previous presentation. I'm going to keep an eye out for any hands going up. Please don't be shy to ask questions, or indeed use the chat window to bring to my attention that you'd like to come in with a question. But I've got a few questions myself, just to get things going. I'm hoping we may wrap up now. It's 8:15. To Nick, the business rates base, I think in previous years we've seen has sort of moved around a bit. And I just wondered what the sort of current picture is for the borough, in terms of whether sort of commercial floor space seems to be growing or shrinking at this point in time.
Very slight decrease. So I think from the previous year, I think our total rateable value was 379 million. That's dropped to 376. So there is a decrease, but it's slowing down, as you'd probably expect towards the end of the rating list anyway. The number of rateable properties hasn't decreased, but often that is due to splits in business premises, which are now being rated as smaller individual units rather than some of the larger buildings that sometimes previously were in rating.
Great, thank you. I can see Sunil's hand has gone up, so if you'd like to come off mute and ask your question.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm a business owner in Southall. I have a retail shop. So the rateable value, I know we've been having grants from you guys, but we have a problem in Southall is the parking problem. And that's where people used to come from, from different parts of the country. But at the moment, they are not coming and they're finding parking is a lot of problem in Southall. So is there something you can give me your views on that, please?
Now that may be a question for one of the councillors to pick up on. I don't know whether Councillor Mahfouz or Councillor Donnelly want to come in there.
Yeah, I'm happy to come back on that. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Sunil, in terms of your question. I think, in fact, we have made significant investment in Southall in terms of parking facilities in the past, and we've actually retained those in terms of proposals that we've taken forward. Clearly, we've got to have that balance between trying to encourage active travel for those who are shopping locally, but clearly completely appreciate that Southall has a very wide casts a wide net in terms of its attraction to people well beyond its borders, and Southall well beyond London, in fact, as well. So clearly, the new station, the very attractive new station, will also hopefully bring people in a sort of in an environmentally friendly way. But we've certainly increased the parking capacity quite considerably in the last few years. But happy to have a further discussion in terms of what more we can do to encourage people to shop in Southall. Just a very sort of top level bit of information, Andrew, as well, as actually that outside of Ealing Broadway, our high streets have been incredibly resilient over the past 2 years, and actually fared better, touch wood, compared to other high streets across the capital and elsewhere. So it's great news that they've been able to do that. Obviously, it's still been a difficult couple of years, absolutely, but we're here standing side by side with our business owners in our high streets to help make sure that they continue to do better than elsewhere in the country.
Well, that's been great to see, as you say, Councillor, and I suppose that's businesses responding to the needs of local residents, and then local residents getting down to their local high streets and supporting the firms. Can I suggest perhaps that you put your email address, Councillor, in the chat, so that if Sunil would like to pick up with you directly on some specifics of the challenges in Southall, he can. I've just got one more question for Nick, and that was to pick up on the London pooling. How optimistic you are that might come back in, and is that something that Ealing would look upon favourably in future?
I think it's something certainly we would consider. Shabana may be able to answer a bit more on some of the technicalities of it. I mean, certainly it gives the whole of London some relative degree of protection. When you look at the likes of City and Westminster, who dwarf us in terms of business, but it also brings its own inherent risks, because if one of those were to have substantial losses, then effectively the pool is there to share some of the burden as well as some of the financial gains. So, but I think in more settled times, I think it's certainly something Ealing would look to consider. And Shabana, I don't know if you want to add anything to that. No. Okay, let's leave it there for now.
Go on, Shabana. I think you're off mute now. No, we still can't hear you, so I'm hoping that fixes itself shortly. As we've got a few questions, perhaps for you and Councillor Donnelly. So thank you very much, Nick, for all your steer there. Going back to that previous agenda item, one question I wanted to sort of put to you, Shabana and Councillor Donnelly, was around the reduction, I think, of 4 million on adult services spend that sort of jumped out. And I just wondered whether you could, if it is indeed, as I read it, sort of reduction from one financial year to the next, how you're achieving that, because that sounds like quite a challenge.
Which part are you referring to, Andrew, just so I'm clear?
I think that was in the sort of in the headline sort of budget, the sort of
Headline.
overview at the very start. There looked
Okay.
like
Well, perhaps
a reduction.
can you bring that slide back up, Shabana, so we can refer to it? I mean, what we do in all our departments, and of course, I should say this is a budget that is proposed to Cabinet to propose to Council. So everything I'm saying to you about these proposals is, in a sense, provisional, but you know, this is the budget I would expect to see go forward. So
it was that drop from 120 million to 116 million.
Yeah, well, we have we've seen adult services has probably been the area where we've had the most dynamic shift in how it has been funded. So we've seen some shift in funding from to the NHS, and we've seen a certain amount of grant allocation that comes via the NHS. But again, you know, we've been living almost quarter to quarter, hand to mouth. So our adult services is ending the year in a much stronger financial position than I had thought it might earlier in the year. But that's partly because of a complex web of grants, which again, it's a difficult platform upon which to plan. But it's so Shabana, I don't know if you can either add anything or say that's complete rubbish, councillor. It's something entirely different. You know, we still can't hear you. Have you enabled your microphone setting? Because sometimes on these web Zooms, even though we've got the app, we have to click to engage the sound. No, we can't. No, you're ostensibly unmuted, but we can't hear you, which tells me that something in the settings is wrong. If you go maybe bottom left, have a look.
It's not picking up your internal microphone.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for your steer there, Councillor, and from the sounds of it, you seem reasonably confident in presenting that reduction in spend that you can hopefully pull it off.
There's huge pressure on adult social care, and obviously the precept's important in that. There's probably even larger pressure in terms of children's services. It gets a lot less coverage. I feel, you know, most people feel maybe less of an immediate connection with the children's services issues. Everybody can kind of project ahead in their own life cycle in terms of their own age or the age of their parents or grandparents. They can project ahead around aspects of adult social care. The children's services is very difficult. Things like unaccompanied asylum seeking children. We voluntarily taken a number of those, and rightly so. But the government at the same time, we discover, suddenly will hire a hotel on the Western Avenue and place them in there and say, right, over to you. And then we get an allowance, which is roughly half of what we actually need to cover the expense of it. And these things hit you absolutely out of the blue. So both in adults and in children's, it's a very volatile position.
Just two more questions for you. I'll give them to you together. So the first is around the council's reserves. I mean, clearly the past 2 years have been pretty volatile and unpredictable. Most of the figures were kind of looking forward. If you look back over the past 2 years, have the council's reserves kind of held up okay? And the second question, a bit different. It was a sort of reference to the empty property charge, and that sort of kicking in after 10 years. And I assume that's to try and sort of avoid development blight and having sort of too many derelict properties in the borough. Is that kind of 10 years set locally or nationally? Is it a statutory 10 years, or do you have some flexibility?
So taking them in order, our reserves have proved adequate, but I guess back to what I was saying, looking again, we thought, well, if another COVID type thing hit, where do we think we stand? And so we think in terms of what we're proposing to Cabinet to propose to Council, we think it's worthwhile making a modest increase in the reserves, and there are various ways in which reserves sit within our budget and our balance sheets. So yes, they were adequate, which is not to say that Ross and Siobhan and the team didn't have to do some pretty fancy footwork to move money in and out as grant funding became available during COVID, and some of that funding came available very late, and some of it at various times was indicated we weren't going to get it, and then at the last minute we did get it. So it's been a roller coaster. On the empty properties thing, my understanding, and again, it's a sliding scale, the longer the property is empty, the higher the multiplier that you're allowed to apply to the premises council tax. So at a couple of years, I think 2 or 3 years, it starts at
that's correct,
double, and then it rolls up to, and then at 10 years, you can now impact. Luckily, I've got Nick back in up to 400%, I think.
Councillor Don is, he's 100% right there. After 2 years, we charge 100% property premium. Any property that's empty over 5 years gets a 200% premium, and anything that's empty over 10 years gets a 300% premium. All of those figures are statutorily supplied by central government, but we as a local council have the option to charge them or not, and we have taken option, but they are statutory period amounts, as Councillor Donnelly correctly stated.
Yeah, I mean, clearly there are instances where the temptation to charge 10,000% would be significant. I mean, the fear, to be honest, is that many of the people to whom this is applying, you could charge them 10,000% and it would just be water off a duck's back, but it doesn't seem to matter.
And so, just to clarify, there are,
your sound's going again.
There are criteria, Andrew, where if people genuinely trying to sell or rent the property. Oh, sorry. I was to say if people are genuinely trying to properties, then those premiums wouldn't apply.
So exceptions can be made, but generally it's there and being used to try and make sure that properties and land are being actively
but the criteria are national criteria, they're not local criteria.
Thank you for that clarification. I don't know whether Shabana's had any luck with her microphone, whether you wanted to add anything on the point around adult services or reserves.
I'll try again. Can you hear me?
We can hear you now. Yes.
Good. I'm glad. So in terms of the adult social care, the position is comparing with the original budget. And obviously, when you're kind of looking at the growth, we're also holding back the growth because the growth hasn't been approved. And for a like for like, I'll just try and share my screen just so I can point to you where I'm talking about. But here we go. It should be coming up in a minute. Will you see it?
Yeah. If I can.
Bigger. So obviously we're in the budget. There's growth being held, which is in the centrally held budget. For a comparator, we've also this is the original budget where the goal the growth that was given in this year is being held back to kind of show comparatively. Otherwise, this would have been a larger increase. So this was the original budget that was presented to Cabinet last year, but obviously in a year we've kind of allocated growth. So they haven't seen a significant drop. There are pressures. We are giving growth, and as Councillor Donnelly had said, there are pressures in other services, and we're continually obviously making savings, but at the same time there's a continuing investment. So there isn't a large drop per se. It's a drop because there's a saving adjusted for in 22-23 as being proposed to Cabinet, but at the same time there'll be growth allocated through the normal growth process, which would kind of look to fund the demand and in-year pressures or around inflation. I hope that answers.
Fantastic. Thank you for that additional insight, Shabana. Well, I can't see any more hands up.
I have.
Okay, Councillor Kumar, please come in with your question. Thank you.
Quickly. No, I just wanted to ask about the time frame around the COF, the Ealing COVID additional restrictions scheme. I know it's been approved, and I understand that you're awaiting software solution, and I know it also can be awarded up to 30 September from what I've seen on screen. But I think it'd be good to know what the time frame around this is likely to be, and would the delay in implementing this would take longer, because it's the council who will identify an award to the qualifying properties.
Nick, do you want to come in on that regarding possible timelines?
I will do. Thanks for that question, Councillor Kumar. Yeah, certainly we would look to get payments out before the end of the financial year, by the 31st of March. Obviously, all of our resources have initially gone onto the grant payments because of the deadline, and effectively the government have given us a use it or lose it for the money they've got. So we need to get those grants out to businesses. Now that process is underway. As soon as we have the software to enable us to do it, we are ready to load that relief. So I would certainly hope that we would get it done before the end of the financial year, which would be before the 31st of March. And ideally, I'd like to get it before we issue next year's council tax bills.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Nick, for that clarification. Thank you to all of the finance team for your contributions and inputs to the meeting this evening, as well as everyone else that has joined us within Zoom, or maybe indeed tuned in via YouTube. As always, I think an insightful session, but clearly challenging times for both our business community and council alike. So I think all we can do is wish everyone well for the year ahead, and hope that when this meeting reconvenes in 12 months' time, it has been a better year than the previous. So thank you all